Hello, 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 hello. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the channel. This is TPP here, and you guys see the thumbnail, right? The thumbnail is about Ken Paxton and the fact that he is behind in Texas. And apparently he is the great hope of the Texas Democratic Party. Yes, he is. Now, please hit the like button. If you come in, please hit the like button. Now, everybody always wants to talk about Ken Paxton. That Ken Paxton. That's the story every headline is chasing. Turning on news, open YouTube, scroll through social media, and you'll see the same conversation over and over again. Can James Talarico beat Ken Paxton? Is Ken Paxton finally vulnerable? Is this the Democrat who can flip Texas finally? The media has already framed this race as a showdown between two men, and I think they're making the same mistake they've been making for years when it comes to Texas politics. They're looking at the opponent instead of looking at the state. They're focused on Ken Paxton when they should be focused on the mountain James Talarico has to climb before Ken Paxton even becomes the biggest obstacle. Okay? The moment I knew I wanted to do this video, right? The moment I knew I wanted to do this video wasn't when James Talarico announced his campaign. He announced that he had beaten Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't another headline about Ken Paxton's legal problem, because he got plenty of legal problems all the time. It wasn't another story about Donald Trump endorsing him, okay? It was when the conversation suddenly shifted to Jasmine Crockett. People started arguing about whether she should immediately throw her full throttle support behind James Talarico. I heard some people today. I heard one guy say, "Oh, I know I can't stand that Jasmine Crockett, blah, blah, blah." Nobody cares what you think if you don't live in Texas. People started arguing about whether she should immediately throw herself behind Talarico. Some people acted like she had an obligation to campaign for him because beating Ken Paxton was too important. Others pushed back and said she didn't know anything to anybody. The debate went on for days and days, and while everybody else was arguing over Jasmine Crockett, I kept thinking that everybody was missing what was really happening in Texas. That argument wasn't really about Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't even about James Talarico. What it exposed were the cracks that still existed inside the Democratic Party. It reminded me that winning statewide election ain't just about finding a charismatic candidate. It's about bringing together a coalition that don't always see every issue the same way, and it don't always have the same priorities, and it doesn't always believe it's being heard. That's not a criticism of James Talarico. Don't get me wrong. It's simply the reality of trying to build a statewide coalition in one of the largest and most politically complicated systems in America. That's when I realized everybody was looking at the wrong race. Everybody sees James Talarico versus Ken Paxton. I see James Talarico versus Texas. Those are two completely different contests. Beating one politician is difficult enough. Building a coalition that can actually win Texas is an entirely different challenge. Because every time I go on to TikTok and Facebook, all them people keep saying, James Talarico can't win. It don't matter what he do. He ain't going to win. And I'm finally beginning to understand what they're talking about. Texas has humbled many a Democratic candidate for more than 3 decades. Beto O'Rourke, same thing. It has humbled candidates who were well-funded. It has humbled candidates who were media darlings. It has humbled candidates who were convinced they had finally found the formula to turn Texas blue. Every election side, we hear that this is a year that Texas is going to change everything. And then election night arrives, and reality has a way of reminding people that Texas plays by its own damn rules. That's why I don't believe Ken Paxton is James Talarico's biggest problem. In fact, I don't think he's even the first problem James Talarico needs to tackle. Before he even shares a debate stage with Ken Paxton, before millions of Texans start comparing the two candidates side by side, Talarico has to overcome challenges that have defeated Democratic campaigns for a generation. He has to deal with a political map that Republicans have spent years strengthening and enforcing. He has to compete in communities where Democrats have steadily lost ground over decades. He has to introduce himself to voters who have already made up their minds about the Democratic Party before they even heard a single fucking word you say. He has to survive culture war attacks that have been incredibly effective in Texas. He has to convince independent voters that he's talking about their everyday lives. He has to energize the Democratic base without taking any part of that coalition for granted. And he has to do all of that while carrying the weight of a national Democratic brand that many Texas voters have already decided that they don't trust. Now, none of this means James Talarico can't win. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that if we're going to have an honest fucking conversation about this race in Texas, then we have to stop pretending it's just about Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton is one candidate. Texas is an entire political ecosystem. It's made up of working class voters, suburban voters, rural voters, black voters, Latino voters, young voters, independents, and evangelicals, lifelong Republicans, lifelong Democrats, and millions of people who don't fit neatly into any political box. Winning statewide means finding enough common ground to build a coalition that's larger than the one Republicans have been putting together for decades. So that's what I want to do today. I want to spend the next couple minutes talking about Ken Paxton's scandals because everybody else is already doing that. Not talking about Ken Paxton's scandals because everybody else is doing that. I want to spend the next hour talking about the challenges James Talarico actually has to overcome if he wants to become the first Democrat elected statewide in generation. Because in my opinion, if he solves these problems that I'm going to present, then Ken Paxton becomes just another opponent to him. But if he doesn't solve these problems, then it won't matter who's on the Republican ticket. The outcome will probably be the same. We've watched play out over decades and decades. So let's start with what I believe is the first biggest hurdle standing between James Talarico and the statewide victory, winning back enough of those white working class voters to make the math work. That's the first thing that he needs to do. White working class voters are his biggest challenge, and it has nothing to do with Ken Paxton or Jasmine Crockett or anybody else. Now, before anybody hears that and immediately thinks I'm making some kind of judgment about white working class voters, let me be very clear. I'm talking about political realities here, not personal worth. I'm talking about a voting bloc that has become one of the biggest reasons Texas keeps going red with shitty ass policies proposed by the Republicans. If James Talarico wants to win statewide in Texas, he has to change the math. That's really what this comes down to. Elections aren't won because somebody gave a great speech. They're not won because somebody went viral on social media. They're not won because MSNBC likes you or because Fox hates you. Elections are won because enough people in enough small spaces decided to vote for you. Right now, that math in Texas is working against Talarico and Democrats in general. One of the biggest reasons is that Democrats have steadily lost support among white working class voters over the last several decades. Now let's define who we're talking about because I don't want anybody creating a straw man. I'm talking about the mechanic, the refinery worker, the factory worker, the chemical plant, the construction worker, the female working at McDonald's, the female working at Kroger's, female working at the grocery store. And somewhere along the way, a lot of these voters never connected with the Democratic Party, even though shitty policies from the Republicans haven't done them any good for decades. Now, whether that's fair or unfair is a completely different conversation. Politics ain't always about what's fair. Politics is about what people believe. If enough voters believe something, it becomes political reality, whether you agree with it or not. That's the first lesson every campaign has to learn. A campaign don't get to run against reality. It has to run inside of reality. And the reality is Republicans have spent years convincing millions of white working class people, Texans, that Democrats don't give a damn about you. They don't respect you. They don't understand you. They don't share your values without presenting working solutions to replace any of the Democratic policies. Now, I know some Democrats hear that and immediately say that's not true. Maybe it ain't. But saying it ain't true don't make voters stop believing it. That's where campaigns lose elections. They spend more time arguing with voters than listening to them. Now, let's think about James Talarico specifically. On paper, he's an outstanding candidate, top tier. He's intelligent, articulate, disciplined. He's a former teacher. He talks openly about his faith. He's calm. He's thoughtful. He's one of the best communicators the Texas Democratic Party has. Those are real strengths. But every strength also creates another challenge because the same qualities that make him appealing to many Democrats can create distance with some working class voters. Think about how he's introduced. Former teacher, Harvard Divinity School, state rep, excellent speaker. Those things impress people like me because I value education. I value a man who's very articulate. But imagine you're sitting at a diner in East Texas. You've been working with your hands all your life. Nobody in your family ever went to Harvard and ain't never going to. You don't spend your nights reading political magazines. You're worried about paying the bill, the mortgage, health care. You're worried about whether your kids can afford to stay in Texas after they graduate. The first question you ask is whether James Talarico is smart. You assume he's smart. The question becomes something completely different. Does this man understand people like me? That's the hurdle. Because people don't vote for candidates they admire. They vote for candidates that believe they understand them. Those aren't always the same thing. One of the biggest mistakes Democrats make is assuming that good policy automatically sells itself. It don't. You can have the best healthcare policy, best education policy, and the best ideas on infrastructure in America. None of that matters. Nobody gives a damn about that if the voter never gets past believing you don't understand what they're going through. That's where messages become just as important as policy. That's how Trump was able to make poor working class people who don't have a damn thing in common with him believe him, vote for him. Him and the Republicans figured this out years ago. Listen to how they talk. They don't spend 10 minutes explaining fucking policy. They talk about paying your bills, food on the table, inflation, gas prices, jobs, crime, inner city crime, immigrants. They make everything sound immediate. Play the victim card to you. Democrats respond with white papers, statistics, policy explanations. There's nothing wrong with facts. I get that. But facts don't automatically create a connection. People have to trust you before they care what your plan is. Now, let me make another point because I think this gets overlooked. The white working class ain't one gigantic block of identical people. Texas ain't Ohio. Texas ain't Pennsylvania. A refining worker in Port Arthur ain't living the same life as a rancher outside Abilene. A welder in Odessa ain't living the same life as somebody working construction outside of Dallas. But they often hear one common message from Republicans. Democrats don't respect your life. Democrats don't understand you. Democrats are woke. Democrats are X, Y, and Z. You say it long enough, people start to believe it. Again, whether that's true, it ain't the point. The point is that millions of voters believed it. James Talarico has to overcome that before he even hear his healthcare plan, his educational plan, his ethics reform plan. Now, here's where I think he has an opportunity, though. Unlike some Democrats, James Talarico talks comfortably about his faith. That matters in Texas. He don't sound uncomfortable discussing religion. He don't sound like somebody trying to avoid the subject. He speaks naturally about his religion. That gives him an opening that many Democratic candidates don't have. He also talks about public education in a way that comes from personal experience instead of political talking points. People generally trust people who have actually done the work. Teachers understand teachers, parents understand teachers. That helps, but it ain't enough by itself. Because this election ain't going to be decided by who gives the best speech. It's going to be decided by whether enough Texans believe James Talarico understands their everyday life better than the Republican nominee does. That's a much harder task. Here's another mistake I think Democrats make. They spend too much goddamn time talking about people who already agree with them or talking to people who already agree with them. It's easy to hold a town hall in Austin or Dallas or get applause at a Democratic convention or a meeting. That's not where statewide elections are won. Statewide elections are won when you walk into communities that haven't voted for your party in years and convince people they should at least listen to what you got to say. You don't have to win every county. You don't even have to win most counties. You don't have to stop losing some of them. But you do have to stop losing some of them by 30 and 40 and 70 points. That's where the math changes. Every percentage point matters. If Republicans are winning certain parts of Texas by overwhelming margins, then Democrats have to produce impossible turnout everywhere else just to keep the race close, especially in those rural communities. That's not a winning strategy. That's survival. James Talarico don't have to win the white working class vote. Let's get that out of the way. No Democrat is expecting that. What he has to do is improve enough to change the statewide numbers from 30 points down to maybe half of that. If Talarico can do that, this is a whole nother ball game. If Democrats cut into those margins across dozens of counties, suddenly Houston, Dallas, and Austin don't have to do all the heavy lifting. The coalition becomes larger because the losses become smaller. That's how statewide elections are won. Not by finding millions of brand new Democratic voters, by making sure Republicans don't keep winning the same voters by overwhelming margins. That's how we win. And that's why I started here with the working class. Not because I think white working class workers are more important than anybody else. They're not. Every demographic we're going to talk about matters. I started here because this is one of the places where the Democratic Party has lost the most ground over the last generation. If James Talarico can make progress here, then everything else we're talking about in this video becomes more achievable. If he can't, then the road to statewide victory becomes dramatically steeper before the campaign even gets to a debate stage with Ken Paxton. That's why I said at the beginning of this video that Ken Paxton ain't James Talarico's biggest problem. The first problem ain't sitting in the Texas Attorney General's office. The first problem is rebuilding enough trust with working class white voters to make the math work again. It's not impossible, but it's one of the hardest things any Democrat running statewide in Texas will ever have to do. Hey, get all those liberals and progressive Democrats that alienated Crockett's people out knocking on doors, setting up town halls, meetings every day in working class neighborhoods, talking to folks, handing out flyers. This is your most urgent problem right here. White working class voters. Second group, we have to move on to the second problem because it's connected to the first one, but it ain't the same thing. A lot of people lump rural Texas and the white working class into one category, and that's a mistake. There are plenty of white working class voters who live in suburbs, just like there are rural Texans who don't fit neatly into any political stereotype. But when we're talking about rural Texas, we're talking about something much bigger than demographics. We're talking about culture, talking about history, talking about communities that often feel forgotten until election season rolls around. One of the biggest mistakes Democrats have made for years is treating rural Texas like it's already lost. They don't say it out loud, but their campaigns often reflect that mindset. Let's hope Talarico gets I hope you got somebody good on your side, bro. I hope you do. Most Democrats spend most of their time in Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Fort Worth, and the fastest growing suburbs because that's where the votes are. From a campaign standpoint, that makes sense. If you're trying to maximize your vote total, you go where the people are. But there's a price you pay when you stop showing up in the rest of the state. People notice that. They notice when you don't visit. They notice when you don't advertise. They notice when the only time they see you, a Democrat, is 2 weeks before an election day, asking for their vote. Politics is a relationship business. You don't build relationships by showing up when you need something. You build relationships by showing up consistently, even when you know you're probably not going to win that county. Republicans understood that years ago. They didn't abandon rural Texas because they were already winning it. They doubled down. They built counties, organizations, relationships with pastors, sheriffs, business owners, campers, ranchers, chambers of commerce. They became part of the community. Democrats in many of those places simply disappeared and didn't want to compete. Okay. Didn't want to compete. I don't have no sound for this. Okay. Let me go here. Okay. So now let's be honest about something. James Talarico. Hold on. James Talarico is not going to win most rural states, most rural counties. That's not a realistic expectation. And nobody who understands Texas politics should pretend otherwise. If somebody tells you that the path to victory is turning the panhandle blue or winning deep East Texas or winning the black vote, they're not being serious about what we're talking about. That's not how Democrats win statewide elections. The goal isn't to flip every county. The goal is to stop getting your ass handed to you on a 60 and 70 point margin. There's a huge difference between losing a county by 45 points and losing about 20 points. Most people don't pay attention to those margins. They just look at whether a county is red or blue. Campaign professionals don't look at it that way. They look at vote totals. If you shave 5 points off the Republican margin in county after county after county after county in Texas, you change the statewide map without ever winning those counties. That's how statewide campaigns are built. Think about it this way. Imagine Republicans carry 50 rural counties by overwhelming margins. Every one of those counties become another brick wall Democrats have to climb over in Houston, Dallas, and Austin. Now imagine those margins start shrinking. Republicans are still winning those counties, but instead of winning 75 to 25, they're winning 60 to 40. They still get the county, they still win the county, but they don't get nearly as many extra votes. Suddenly those urban Democratic strongholds don't have to produce impossible turnout just to stay competitive. That's why I think people misunderstand what success would actually look like for James Talarico. Success ain't turning every county blue. Success is making Republicans fight for votes they've taken for granted for decades. Success is forcing the Republican campaign to spend time and money defending areas they normally put on the autopilot. Success is making them work for it. Now here's the challenge. Rural Texas doesn't just see politics differently. In many cases, rural Texas sees the Democratic Party differently. For a lot of voters in the community, the Democratic Party ain't viewed as neighbor with a neighbor with different ideas. It's viewed as an outsider trying to tell them how to live. Again, whether that's fair or not really ain't the point. Perception exists, and campaigns have to deal with perceptions, whether they like it or not. When people in rural communities hear national Democrats talking about energy policy, many of them don't even hear environmental protection. They hear somebody talking about the industry that put food on the table. When they hear debates over regulations, they don't necessarily think about climate change or corporate accountability, shit like that. They think about whether another regulation means another local business closes or another job disappears. Those are the real concerns to the people living there, even if somebody else disagrees with how they interpret that issue. That's where James Talarico has a challenge. He has to convince people that he sees them, respects them, and understands why they're worried. Notice I didn't say he has to agree with every concern. That's impossible. No candidate agrees with every voter, but there's a big difference between disagreeing with somebody and making them feel invisible. Too many rural Texans believe Democrats stopped listening to them a long time ago. Rebuilding that trust isn't something you accomplish with one campaign commercial. It takes years. I also think Democrats sometimes underestimate how much pride exists in these communities. Rural Texans don't generally see themselves as victims waiting for government to rescue them. They take pride in taking care of themselves, their family, and their neighbors. Whether it's farming, ranching, oil, gas, running a small business, there's deep culture of independence. If your message sounds like you're talking down to them or suggesting they need somebody from Austin to explain their own lives, you probably lost them before the conversation even gets started. That's why tone matters just as much as policy. You can have a policy that generally benefits rural communities, but if the message comes across as dismissive, condescending, people won't stop listening. Respect has to come first. Listening has to come first. Understanding has to come first. And here's something else that often gets overlooked. Rural voters don't spend every waking hour thinking about politics. Just like everybody else, they're thinking about whether the local hospital is staying open. They're thinking about kids driving all the way here and there for a specialist. They're thinking about the conditions of the road, whether they get internet, whether the internet reaches their neighborhood, whether the school's good, whether the teacher's good, whether the generation can move into this community and stay there for years and years. Those are the issues Democrats could compete on if they're willing to have those conversations in ways that starts with the community instead of the party. This is why I don't think James Talarico's challenge in rural Texas is ideological as much as it's relational. Before people will trust your policy, they have to believe you respect them. Before they believe you understand their problems, they have to believe they're actually listening. That takes time. It takes consistency. It takes showing up when there isn't a television camera waiting for you. And it takes accepting that sometimes you're going to walk into a room where almost nobody agrees with you. That's part of the job if you're serious about winning statewide in Texas. Somebody told me the other day, they keep telling me, TPP, HQ, people don't agree with you. I don't care whether they agree with me or not. I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to keep saying what I'm saying because there's people out there that will listen and hear what I have to say, and they will resonate with that. The bottom line here is simple. James Talarico does not have to win rural Texas. He does have to make Republicans work harder than they've had to work in a very long time. If he can reduce those margins from those margins like 75 to 25, and he can take it down to 60 to 40, he might have a shot. If he can reduce those compete in communities Democrats have largely abandoned and convince enough rural Texans that he's willing to hear them before he asks for their vote, then the statewide map starts to look very differently. If he can't, then Republicans will continue using rural Texas as the foundation that carries them through every statewide election, no matter how well Democrats perform in the cities. One of the biggest political myths in America is that rural voters don't care about the issues. They absolutely care about the issues. They just don't always rank the same issues in the same order as voters in downtown Austin or Houston. That's where campaigns get themselves into trouble. They assume everybody is voting with the same priorities. And when they don't, they write those voters off instead of asking why. Let's talk healthcare as an example. Democrats talk about expanding healthcare access, and that's an issue James Talarico has talked about repeatedly. That message should resonate in rural Texas because many rural communities have watched hospitals close or reduce services. People drive further for emergency care than they used to. Finding specialists can mean driving across multiple counties. Those are real problems. But if the first thing a voter hears is a national political argument instead of a local problem being solved, the opportunity is lost. Rural voters don't wake up saying, I wonder where Washington thinks today. They wake up wondering if their local hospital will still be there when somebody in their family has a heart attack. Same thing applies to public education. James Talarico probably has more credibility on education than almost anybody running statewide because he actually taught in public schools. That's not something he can manufacture. It's part of his life story. But if that story turns into a lecture about what rural communities are doing wrong instead of a conversation about keeping good teachers in small town, improving local schools, and giving parents confidence that their children don't have to leave home to get a quality education, then Republicans will redefine that message before it ever reaches the people who need to hear it. So then there's the infrastructure. Most people don't get excited about infrastructure until something breaks. A bridge closes. A road washes out. All of those things. They know what unreliable internet means when you're trying to run a business. Help your kids with homework or even work from home. Those are kitchen table issues. Those aren't Democratic issues or Republican issues. Those are everyday life issues. That's why I think Democrats sometimes overcomplicate their message. People don't need to hear a 25-minute explanation on how a bill works. They want to know one thing. How is this going to make my life better? James Talarico can answer that question in plain English. He'll have a better chance of reaching voters who normally wouldn't even consider listening to a Democrat. There's another challenge that doesn't get enough attention, and that's trust. Trust ain't built because you show up with a good platform. Trust is built because people believe you'll still be around after the election is over. That's one of the advantages Republicans have in rural Texas, whether people agree with Republicans or not. They see Republicans in their community. They see them at county fairs. They see them at churches. They see them in local businesses. They see them supporting the volunteer fire department. Politics in small communities is personal. Relationships matter. That's why campaigns built entirely around television commercials almost never change minds in these areas. A 30-second ad doesn't replace years of personal relationships. Now, let me say something that some Democrats probably won't like to hear. I don't think every rural voter who supports a Republican is voting because of Donald Trump. I think that's an easy explanation, but it's an incomplete one. Some people are voting Republican because that's the party their family has voted for over 20, 25 years. Some are voting based on taxes. Some are voting based on guns. Some are voting based on religion, abortion. Some because they work in industries they believe Republicans will protect. Some because they simply don't trust Democrats. If James Talarico treats every one of those voters like they're motivated by exactly the same thing, he'll make the same mistake campaigns have been making for years. Every voter has a story. Every community has a story. The campaign that takes the time to understand those stories usually performs better than the campaign that assumes it already knows all the answers. This is where I think James Talarico has an opportunity. White working class voters, rural voters, if he leans into it. One of his strengths is that he doesn't come across as angry. Whether you agree with his politics or not, he generally comes across as thoughtful, respectful, and willing to have conversations. That style may not generate the loudest headlines, but it can open doors that would otherwise stay closed. If he can sit down with people who disagree with him without treating them like enemies, he has a chance to at least be heard. In today's political environment, being heard is the first step towards changing minds. None of this guarantees success. Rural Texas isn't going to suddenly become Democratic because one candidate runs a better campaign. Political habits built over decades don't disappear in one election cycle. But campaigns aren't creating miracles. They're about creating movements. If James Talarico can move the numbers just enough in county after county, if he can convince some voters to take a second look, if he can earn respect even from people who don't ultimately vote for him, then he's building something bigger than one election. That's why I don't believe the rural Texas problem is impossible to solve. I think it's incredibly difficult, but difficulty isn't the same as impossible. It requires patience. It requires humility. It requires showing up in spaces where you know you're not going to get a standing ovation. Now, if these first two problems were about geography and community, the next problem is about one of the biggest political shifts Texas has seen in generations. For years, Democrats believed demographic change alone would eventually turn Texas blue. They assumed one voting bloc would continue supporting them by overwhelming margins. The last several election cycles have shown that assumptions was far too simple. That's where James Talarico runs into problem number 3, the changing of the Latino vote. For years, Democrats have told themselves the same story about Texas. They looked at the state's changing demographic and convinced themselves that time was on their side. They believed that the Latino population continued to grow. Texas would naturally become more competitive for Democrats. Some people even acted like it wasn't a matter of Texas would turn blue. It just was a matter of when. They looked at the census numbers, population growth, voter registration, and they thought eventually Democrats would overrun the Republican Party or dominance. Politics don't work that way. People aren't demographic statistics. People are individuals. People change. Communities change. Issues change. One of the biggest political stories in Texas over the last several years has been watching Republicans make significant gains with Latino voters in parts of the state where Democrats once assumed they were untouchable. That should have been a wake-up call for the Democrats. Instead, too many Democrats treated it like a fluke. It wasn't. If you look at South Texas, if you look at parts of the Rio Grande, if you look at counties that Democrats used to win comfortably, Republicans have been steadily making inroads. Not everywhere, not with every Latino community, but enough to change statewide elections. That matters because Democrats don't have a lot of room for error. If Republicans improve with Latino voters while holding their advantages with white working class, Democrats have to make up those losses somewhere, somehow. That's incredibly difficult in a state the size of Texas. Now, let's be careful here because I don't want to lump every Latino voter into one category. That's one of the mistakes both parties make. The Latino community in Texas is incredibly diverse. A family that lived in South Texas for generations may have very different priorities than someone living in Houston, Dallas, or El Paso. Religions vary. Immigration experiences vary. That's why campaigns that assume all Latino voters think alike usually end up disappointing themselves. One of the biggest misconceptions Democrats have held on to is that immigration is automatically the number one issue for every Latino voter. It's not. If you're trying to pay your mortgage, keep your small business open. If you work in the oil industry, energy policy may be your biggest concern. If you're raising kids, education. If you're attending church, religion, social issues. Just because somebody's Latino doesn't mean immigration automatically outweighs everything else happening in their lives. Republicans figured that out. Instead of assuming Latino voters only cared about immigration, they started talking about jobs, economy, public safety, cost of living. They also leaned heavily into messages about faith, family, patriotism, and entrepreneurship. Whether you agree with these messages or not, they were speaking to issues many Latino families already cared about. Democrats have often responded by talking about policy. Republicans talked about identity. That's a powerful difference. People don't just vote based on policy. They vote based on whether they feel seen and heard. That's where James Talarico has both an opportunity and a challenge. One thing working in his favor is that he doesn't sound like the stereotypical national Democrat Republicans often put in television commercials. He talks about faith comfortably. He talks about family. He doesn't sound angry. He doesn't spend all his time trying to score points on social media. Those things could help him connect with voters who may have already tuned out the National Democratic brand. But he still has to overcome the brand. Whether he likes it or not, Republicans aren't going to run against James Talarico, the individual. They're going to run against the Democratic Party. And they're going to use the culture wars to do it. Every television commercial will try to make him look like every Democrat is skeptical voter, woke, gay, trans, uppity. That's how they're going to run against him. They'll tie him to national political fights, whether he wants to talk about them or not. They'll spend millions of dollars making sure voters aren't judging James Talarico based on what he says. They'll try to make sure voters judge him based on what they think the Democratic Party represents. That's the challenge. Can he separate himself enough from the national brand to earn a hearing? Because that's really the first hurdle. Before voters evaluate your ideas, they have to decide whether they're going to listen to you or not. Now, let's talk about South Texas specifically, because I think it's one of the most misunderstood political regions in America. Hold on. People who don't live here. Let me move here. People who don't live in South Texas don't deal with conversations of immigration, or that's not the most important. People who live there know life is much more complicated than immigration. These are the communities built around family, church, local relationships, and many families have served in the military. Many work in law enforcement. Many own small businesses. Many work in energy, transportation, healthcare, agriculture. They're proud Texans and proud Americans. Their political identity ain't nearly as simple as outsiders sometimes imagine. If Democrats approach these communities assuming they already know what matters to them, they're going to keep making the same mistakes. The first step is talking. First step is listening. That's true whether you talk about Latino voters, Black voters, rural voters, suburban voters. People generally know when you're trying to understand them and when you're simply trying to appease them. James Talarico's campaign is going to have to prove that it's interested in both of those things. Because if Republicans continue making gains with Latino voters while Democrats continue losing ground in rural Texas, the statewide math becomes much harder to overcome. That's why I believe this isn't just another demographic challenge. It's one of the defining political battles of modern Texas. It's one James Talarico cannot afford to lose. Now, let me tell you where I think Democrats sometimes get themselves in trouble. They spend a lot of time talking about what voters should care about instead of talking about what they already care about. Those are two completely different conversations. You don't persuade people by telling them their priorities are wrong. You persuade people by meeting them where they're at and showing them why your ideas make their life better. Take inflation. Democrats can point to charts, explain supply chains, and talk about global economic pressures all day. None of that changes what somebody experiences every Saturday when they walk into the grocery store and the prices are high. A family feels like they're spending $200 every month extra to feed their kids. That's their reality. They don't need somebody explaining why it happens nearly as much as they want somebody explaining what they're going to do about it. Republicans have done a much better job of speaking directly to that frustration, even when the solutions they're offering are debatable. These messages are simple. Your life costs more than it used to. We're going to fix it, or we're going to try to fix it. Democrats often answer with a 5-minute explanation. In politics, the simpler message usually will win. Same thing applies to energy. Texas ain't California. Energy ain't some abstract political issue here. It's people's livelihoods, paychecks, it's retirement accounts. It's entire communities built around oil, gas, petrochemicals, pipelines, refinery, and the business that support those industries. When people hear national Democrats talking about moving away from fossil fuels, they don't hear clear energy. They hear somebody wants to eliminate my job. Whether that's an accurate interpretation ain't really the point. That's what they hear. If James Talarico wants to compete in Texas, he has to explain what the future looks like for those workers instead of assuming they'll automatically embrace change because it's good policy. Then there's religion. And I think this is one place where James Talarico has an advantage that most Democrats don't. He talks about his faith naturally. He doesn't sound like somebody who suddenly discovered church because he's running for office. People can usually tell a difference, but there's a difference between speaking about your faith and convincing deeply religious communities that your political priorities line up with theirs. That's another hurdle he'll have to clear. Simply talking about Christianity don't automatically erase disagreements over abortion, LGBT, trans, other cultural debates that become central to modern politics. This is where I think Republicans will spend an enormous amount of money. They won't spend much time arguing over James Talarico's educational funding proposals. They won't spend much time arguing over teachers' pay. They won't spend much time debating healthcare either. They'll spend their money trying to convince Latino voters that James Talarico don't share their values. Whether that's true or not almost becomes secondary because campaigns aren't just battles over facts. They're battles over perception. Republicans understand that. They built an entire political machine around defining Democrats before Democrats even have a chance to define themselves. Now let's talk about something Democrats almost never admit publicly. There has been a tendency within the party to believe that demographic growth automatically equals demographic growth automatically means democratic growth. That's proven to be a dangerous assumption. Just because a community is growing doesn't mean the community is moving toward your party. Voters aren't inherited. Every generation has to be persuaded. Every election starts at zero. Republicans understood they couldn't keep writing off Latino communities if they wanted to maintain their statewide edge in Texas. So they started investing time, money, organization in places Democrats assumed would always be theirs. Politics rewards the party that competes. It punishes the party that assumes. That's one reason I don't think James Talarico can afford to run a campaign based on assumptions. He can't assume Latino voters will support him because he's a Democrat. He has to earn those votes. He has to show up. He has to listen. He has to understand the different Latino communities. That's going to be hard work. There's another piece of this that don't get talked about enough. Many Latino families in Texas are upwardly mobile. They own businesses. They buy homes. They build wealth. As people's lives change, sometimes their politics change too. That's not unique to the Latino voter. It happens across every demographic. Priorities evolve. Economic interests evolve. That's why campaigns have to evolve too. If Democrats keep using the same playbook they used 15 years ago, they're going to keep running into the same disappointing results. At the end of the day, James Talarico doesn't need to win every Latino voter. He doesn't need to carry every county along the border, but he absolutely cannot allow Republicans to continue making gains in communities Democrats once counted as reliable. As important as the Latino vote is, however, there's another part of the Democratic coalition that no statewide Democrat can afford to take for granted. If Latino voters help determine whether Democrats can compete, Black voters often determine whether Democrats can win. And that's where James Talarico faces what may be the most delicate balancing act of his entire campaign. If there's one part of the Democratic coalition that James Talarico cannot afford to misunderstand, it's the black voter. Let me go ahead and say that up front, because sometimes campaigns make a mistake that costs them before the general election even begins. They assume the black voters are simply going to show up because the alternative is a Republican, and most black voters don't vote Republican. That thinking has hurt Democrats before, and if they're not careful, it'll hurt them again. Black voters have been the most loyal voting bloc in the Democratic Party for decades. Election after election, they have shown up, organized, volunteered, knocked on doors, made phone calls, worked polling locations, and carried Democratic candidates across the finish line in races all over the country. The loyalty is one of the reasons Democrats remain competitive in states they otherwise wouldn't be competitive in. But loyalty shouldn't be confused with obligation. Black voters are not obligated to be enthusiastic simply because somebody has a D besides their name. That's one of the reasons I paid so much close attention to what happened to Jasmine Crockett. People were asking why she wasn't immediately out campaigning for James Talarico. Some people acted like she owed him that support. She don't owe him that support. It's for him to earn that support. Others questioned her priorities. The other day, I was kind of disappointed because she said, are you going to vote? Are you going to campaign for James Talarico? And she said, oh, I don't know. I'm going to do something down ballot or something, she said, really half-heartedly. I was kind of disappointed in the way in her response, right? If she didn't want to campaign, she should have at least encouraged people to take a look at James Talarico's campaign and look at his campaign honestly and see if they wanted to vote for him. She should have at least encouraged them to look at his campaign better instead of saying, focus on Ken Paxton, focus on Ken Paxton. No, you needed to do better when it came to another Democrat. That's all I'm saying. She should have done better when it came to another Democrat. Maybe not say I'm going to vote, maybe not say I'm going to campaign for him, but at least be enthusiastic for the Democratic Party. We want the Democratic Party to win. You need to take a look at Talarico's campaign again. He's the person competing with Ken Paxton, blah, blah, blah. Instead of being very dismissive. I was very disappointed in that. Not saying she has an obligation. Not saying she has to be full throttled with it. But she does need to have steered them closer to the Democratic Party instead of saying, I don't know who y'all going to vote for. I don't care who you vote for. That's the way it sounded, like she didn't care about anything, any kind of party democratically. And she's from Texas. Okay. She was the reason why I paid a lot of attention to the Republican, the race in Texas. People were asking why she wasn't immediately out there campaigning for him. That's why I think maybe it's sore loser is not the word. I don't know, but it seemed like it was a sore loser attitude. That's what it seemed like to me. But that's just me. Other people question her priorities. I remember sitting there thinking that people weren't paying attention to what the conversation actually represented. It wasn't really about Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't about expectations. It was about who gets asked to carry the Democratic Party every cycle. It was about who gets called when it's time to turn out votes. It was about whether relationships inside the coalition are reciprocal or transactional. Those are legitimate conversations. All I'm telling you is you need to do something with the Black Democratic vote, because you're starting to lose the Democratic vote because you say they feel like they're being taken advantage of, taken for granted. Okay, now let me be very clear, because I don't want anybody twisting what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting James Talarico has done anything to disrespect Black voters. I'm not talking about the broader political environment he's stepping into. That's not what I'm saying. He's inheriting decades of expectations, frustrations, and political history that existed long before he announced his campaign. Campaigns don't happen in a vacuum. Every candidate walks into an existing political relationship. James Talarico is no different. He shouldn't expect anything from Jasmine Crockett. But Jasmine Crockett, as a Democrat, could go a little bit further than what she did. Okay? It was like she shunned his campaign. That's what it felt like. I don't know whether it was the true or not, but that, are you going to vote? Are you going to campaign for Talarico? I don't know. Blah, blah. She said, I don't know. She said something. And I thought it was very cavalier for a sitting Democrat to say that about another Democrat. He won fair and square, unless you didn't think he won fair and square. Okay, maybe that was it. Maybe she didn't think he won fair and square. Maybe she didn't think he won. He represented her at all fairly when it came to closing the polling places, and their people calling her phone line, begging her to help him with his campaign. Okay, now here's where I think James Talarico has an opportunity. Unlike most politicians, he doesn't come across as somebody who's simply checking demographic boxes. He doesn't strike me as someone who would only show up in black churches 2 weeks before election day. He's not the type of person that shows up and takes pictures and delivers speeches and disappears into campaign time. I think he's capable of building genuine relationships, but capable isn't the same thing as having already done it. Those relationships still have to be built. They have to be earned. Trust has to be earned. Respect has to be earned. Political capital has to be earned. That's true no matter who you are. Now let's talk about the turnout. Every time Democrats lose Texas, somebody immediately says they just needed higher turnout. That's partially true. But turnout doesn't magically happen because somebody says it's important. People vote when they believe their vote matters. People vote when they believe the candidate understands them. People vote when they believe something meaningful is at stake. You can't manufacture enthusiasm 3 weeks before the election day. You build enthusiasm over months and years. Black voters understand political power probably better than almost any voting bloc in this country because they've had to fight for it. But now they're feeling taken advantage of. Now in Texas, they're feeling like they're needed only for the vote. Vote blue no matter who. That's what they're feeling like. And now they're feeling like they don't want to vote. That's why I simply ask people to vote. Voting isn't enough anymore. People want to know what comes at the election, what happens at the victory speech, who's showing up, who's listening, who's still answering the phone. Those questions matter. Now, here's another reality James Talarico has to deal with. Black voters are not a monolith. Just because somebody is black doesn't mean they care about every issue equally. Some primarily concerned about education, healthcare, affordable housing, small business, public safety, voting. Others think about all other things, maybe not the same. Campaigns that assume every black voter is motivated by exactly the same message usually misses the complexity of that community. Now let's talk about Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth. Those cities don't simply produce Democratic votes. They produce Democratic energy. They're where volunteers come from, organizers come from, churches come from, community organizations come from. They're where local elected officials often become trusted voices long before statewide candidates arrive. James Talarico cannot simply parachute into those communities expecting an enthusiasm to already be waiting for him. He has to become part of the conversation. He has to spend time there. He has to build relationships there. He has to demonstrate that those communities matter even when cameras aren't rolling, because one thing black voters have become very good at is recognizing the difference between somebody building a relationship and somebody building a campaign. Those aren't always the same thing. And if Democrats want to keep one of the strongest part of their coalition energized, they have to stop treating enthusiasm like it's automatic. It's not. It's not. So you got to do something. James Talarico's challenge isn't simply turning out black voters. His challenge is convincing black voters that his campaign is another step forward in a long-term relationship, not just another election where they're expected to save the Democratic Party one more time. That's a much bigger assignment that most political commentators are talking about. But if he gets it right, it strengthens every other part of his coalition. If he gets it wrong, then one of the strongest foundations of a statewide Democratic campaign becomes much harder to sustain. He shouldn't lose. Quite frankly, Talarico shouldn't lose Texas. As shitty a candidate as Paxton is, it should be a no-brainer. It should be a no-brainer for most people. Okay? But he's got some work to do. Okay? There's another piece to this that I think gets overlooked because people spend so much time talking about turnout, they forget to talk about trust. Those two things go hand in hand. People don't just vote because somebody tells them to. This is the most important election of their lifetime. Black voters have heard that speech for decades. Every 2 years, they told democracy is on the line. Every 2 years, they're told it's at stake. Every 2 years, they're asked to save the country, save the state, save the Democratic Party. At some point, people start asking a reasonable question. What happened after I showed up the last time? It's not cynicism, that's accountability. One of the things I've always believed is that Democrats have to start treating black voters like they're an emergency response team. You don't call the fire department after your house is already burned down. You build relationships with these black voters before you need them. You invest in communities before election day. You don't suddenly discover black churches 6 weeks before people start voting. When you go to Washington and you're a representative of Washington, you need to bring money back to the community to help the community. You need to bring resources back to the community to help the community. Black voters are asking, what have you done for us lately? What are you doing for us lately? Have you brought any funds back? Have you gotten roads, bridges, schools, funding? Have you done anything for the black community? This is what they're asking in Texas. You don't suddenly start talking about issues that existed for years. Don't nobody give a damn about issues that existed for years. Have you tried to solve any of those? People notice these things. They may still vote for you, but they notice. That's why I think James Talarico has to approach this differently. He has an opportunity because he isn't carrying decades of statewide political baggage. Most Texans are still getting to know his ass. That can be an advantage if he uses it wisely. He can introduce himself on his own terms instead of trying to convince people he's different from who they already think he is. But introducing yourself and building trust are two different things. I also think Democrats sometimes misunderstand what enthusiasm actually looks like. Enthusiasm isn't measured by applause at a rally. It's measured by likes on social media. It isn't measured by how many people share a campaign video. Real enthusiasm shows up on Saturday morning when volunteers knocking on doors in neighborhoods that television cameras never visit. Real enthusiasm shows up when people are willing to spend their own time convincing family members, co-workers, and neighbors to vote. That's the kind of enthusiasm campaigns can't buy. They have to earn it. Now let me bring Jasmine Crockett back into this conversation because I think she represents something larger than one member of Congress, right? Jasmine Crockett has become one of the most recognizable Democrats in the country because she speaks in a way that feels authentic to the people who support her. Whether somebody agrees with everything she says isn't really the point. Don't nobody give a damn. People believe they're getting the real Jasmine Crockett. That authenticity matters in modern politics. It's one reason she has built such a loyal following. When people start criticizing her because she wasn't immediately centering James Talarico's campaign, I thought that criticism missed something vital. Leaders have responsibility to the people who elected them. They also have their own political priorities, their own races, their own judgment about where their time should be spent. Support isn't something you demand. It's something you build. If Jasmine Crockett decides to campaign for James Talarico, I hope it's because she genuinely believes in his campaign, not because people on social media try to shame her into doing so. That's another lesson statewide candidates have to understand, specifically when you overlook this very, very competent black woman. You overlooked Kamala. You overlooked Jasmine Crockett. You overlooked, her name is Stacey Abrams. You overlooked very qualified black women. And now you have people in the black party, Democratic Party, up in arms because of that. Because Jasmine was a very capable person. Don't nobody give a damn if you think she wasn't or she wasn't. She has a big following who thought she was. Okay? Authentic support always looks different from political obligation. Let's hope she decides that she's going to support. Now, let's look at Houston for a minute, because Houston tells us something about Texas politics that people often overlook. Harris County is one of the most diverse counties in America. It's also one of the engines that Democrats depend on every election cycle. But Harris County alone can't elect a statewide candidate. Neither can Dallas County. Neither can Travis. Democrats need overwhelming support in those places, but they also need enough support elsewhere that those urban votes aren't constantly trying to overcome enormous Republican margins across the rest of the state. That's why I keep coming back to a coalition. Every part of this coalition matters. Black voters, Latino voters, young voters, rural voters, white working class voters, college educated suburban voters, independent voters. You can't afford to lose one group while hoping another group makes up the difference. Black voters ain't going to help you make up the difference in Texas. Look at Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke had 97% of the black vote and they still lost. So it ain't about having a black vote. It's about having a whole bunch of y'all, a whole bunch of people, whole bunch of groups, okay? Texas is simply too big and Republican margins have been too consistent for too long. You need help. One thing I don't want this conversation to become is another discussion where people start ranking which voting block is more important than another one. That's not the point. The point is that every statewide campaign has to put together enough pieces to get over that 50%. If one piece weakens, another piece has to become even stronger. That's why I said at the beginning of this video that James Talarico ain't really running against Ken Paxton. He's running against 30 years of political math. Now, if black voters represent the foundation of the Democratic coalition, the next challenge is completely different because it isn't about loyalty or enthusiasm. It's about participation. Democrats have one group of voters they get incredibly excited about every election cycle. In every election cycle, they end up asking the same damn question after the votes are counted. Where did everybody go? That brings us to the next challenge Talarico has to solve. Young voters. Every election cycle, Democrats get excited about young voters. Every election cycle, somebody puts out polling showing that younger voters, younger Texans overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates. And every election cycle, people start talking about a youth wave that's finally going to change. Then election day comes, votes get counted, Democrats are left asking themselves what the hell happened. The enthusiasm was real, crowds were real, so where did everybody go? That's a real question James Talarico has to answer because whether people realize it or not, he's probably one of the strongest candidates Democrats could put in front of young voters. He's young enough to relate to them. He's comfortable on social media. He doesn't sound like a career politician. But here's the problem. Getting young people excited and getting young people to vote, two totally different things. One is emotional, the other is behavioral. Young voters tend to be enthusiastic about ideas. They tend to be passionate about ideas. They care about housing, affordability, student debt, blah, blah, blah. Those concerns are real. They're not imagined. But caring deeply about those things doesn't automatically translate into voting. That's been one of the biggest frustrations for Democrats for decades. Young people consistently tell pollsters they support Democratic candidates by large margins, but older voters consistently show up in greater numbers. Now, that's not saying young voters don't matter. They absolutely do matter. In fact, they may become one of the most important voting blocks in Texas over the next decade. But campaigns have to deal with the electorate they actually have, not the electorate that they wish they had. One thing Republicans understand very well is consistency. Older voters vote. They don't need to be reminded every 5 minutes. They don't need celebrity endorsements. They don't need TikTok videos. They just need turnout. Now, I don't think it's because young people don't care. I think they care a great deal. I think part of the problem is that they've grown up watching politics disappoint them. They watch political dysfunction. They watch Congress struggle to accomplish even basic governing. So that means they won't show up. Skepticism doesn't necessarily produce apathy, but it darn sure don't produce votes. Okay, it produces frustration. Talarico has the challenge. He has to convince them that elections actually matter. That's becoming harder and harder every election cycle. Now look, one thing working in his favor is credibility, right? Again, he's a teacher. That matters. He spent time in classrooms. He's worked with young people. He understands education. That gives him credibility that can't be manufactured by a political consultant. But credibility only gets you in the door. It doesn't guarantee turnout. It requires registration, organization, making sure students know where to vote, making sure they can vote, requires making voting easy enough that life doesn't get in the way. Campaigns spend millions of dollars talking about young voters. Sometimes they don't spend enough time talking about young voters, actually navigating the voting process. Now, let's talk about college campuses. Every election cycle, Democrats fill auditoriums and universities. The rallies look good, students cheer, videos go viral. Republicans know this too. They don't spend nearly as much time trying to win those campuses. Instead, they focus on voters who already have a long history of voting. That's the big difference. James Talarico probably can't afford to ignore this young group. He needs young voters because they naturally connect with many of his priorities. He can't afford to miss those people. Campaigns built on hope usually lose. Campaigns built on organization usually perform better. That's why I think Democrats need to stop talking about the youth vote like it's some magical event waiting to happen. Young voters aren't coming to save anybody. That's part of the coalition. They're a part of this coalition. The campaign still has to compete everywhere else. That's the reality of Texas. College-educated suburban voter. Now, I don't think he has too much of a problem with that, but we're finally getting to where I believe James Talarico has his biggest strength. Everything we've talked about so far has been an uphill battle. The white working class is difficult. Rural Texas is difficult. Getting young people to actually vote is difficult. But then you get to the suburbs, and this is where the political landscape starts to change. If you had asked somebody 15 years ago or 20 years ago where Democrats could seriously compete in places like Plano, Frisco, Sugar Land, Denton County, they probably would have laughed. These communities were considered safely Republican. They were filled with professionals. But politics change. People change. Community change. It happened for a lot of reasons. Population growth, changes in education, changes in voting. Now, here's why that matters for James Talarico. This is where his biography actually works in his favor. Let's be honest, James Talarico is comfortably talking policy. Disciplined, measured, educated. He doesn't come across as somebody looking for the next viral moment. For a lot of college-educated suburban voters, those aren't weaknesses, those are strengths. They care about government, public school, infrastructure, policy, traffic. They care about whether their kids receive a good education. They're not necessarily looking for political entertainment. They're looking for stability. James Talarico speaks that language naturally. That's why I think this is probably the easiest audience for him to connect with in Texas. But here's where campaigns make another mistake. They confuse their strongest audience with their entire audience. Just because somebody is doing well in the suburbs doesn't mean they're doing well statewide. In fact, that's one of the biggest traps Democrats have fallen into over the last several election cycles. They watched themselves make gains in suburban counties and convinced themselves the entire state was moving in that direction. It wasn't. While Democrats were improving in many suburbs, Republicans were strengthening their position in the other parts of Texas. The gains and losses started canceling each other out. Now let's look at Collin County, Dalton, Denton County, Williamson County, Fort Bend. Those places matter because they're growing. Every year more people move there. If Democrats want to become competitive statewide, they have to perform extremely well in those communities. Not just well, extremely well. James Talarico probably understands that. His campaign almost certainly understands that. But here's what concerns me. What if he becomes too successful there? Now, that sounds like a strange thing to say. How can somebody become too successful with their strongest voters? Here's what I mean. Campaigns already naturally spend more time where they receive positive feedback. And if every town hall in Plano is packed, fundraiser Round Rock is packed, Sugar Land is packed, there's a temptation to keep doing more of that. Human nature pulls us toward comfortable audiences. Why spend 3 hours driving to a county where most people disagree with you when you can spend those 3 hours with somebody who agrees with you? Because statewide campaigns aren't built inside comfort zones. They're built by expanding beyond those. That's why I think James Talarico has to be very careful. The suburbs should absolutely be one of the foundations of his campaign, but they cannot become the entire campaign. If every commercial, every speech, every policy, every interview is designed around college suburban voters, then everybody else starts feeling like they're watching somebody else's campaign. That's dangerous. Remember, he has to talk to the refinery, the rancher, the trucker. They all have to see themselves somewhere in this campaign. If they don't, this coalition will never get off the ground. So James Talarico has a problem. Now let's address the culture war. Now we've reached the part of the campaign that I think is going to determine whether James Talarico ever gets a chance to make this case to the people of Texas. Everything we've talked about so far assumes voters are listening to what he has to say. But modern campaigns don't work like that anymore. The first objective isn't to beat your opponent on the issues. The first objective is to define your opponent before they have a chance to define themselves. Republicans understand that better than anybody. Let's be honest about what we're talking about. Republicans are not going to spend millions of dollars talking about James Talarico ideas of public education. They're not going to spend millions talking about healthcare. They're not going to spend millions talking about teacher salaries or rural hospitals or the electric grid. Why would they? Hold on a minute. All right. They're going to make this about fear. They're going to make this about values. They're going to make this about identity. Because culture war politics has been one of the Republicans' most effective political weapons in Texas for years. Y'all come shut the door. Shut the door. Okay. Because culture war politics has been one of the Republican Party's most effective political weapons. Now, before somebody accuses me of saying culture doesn't matter, let me stop you right there. Culture absolutely matters. Families care about culture. Parents care about culture. Churches care about culture. Communities care about culture. These aren't fake issues. These are real issues to the people voting in Texas. The question isn't whether culture matters. The question is whether culture becomes so dominant that nobody ever gets around to talking about anything else. Think about that several statewide elections. How much time did people spend talking about property taxes compared to drag shows, compared to trans, gay, abortion? How many times did they spend talking about the electric grid compared to transgender? I'm saying they become so powerfully, politically powerful that they often push every other conversation off the table. That's exactly where Republicans want this race to go. They don't want James Talarico explaining why public schools need more funding. They don't want him talking about why insurance rates keep climbing. They don't want him talking about why people can't afford housing. They want voters talking about the culture war every single day until election day. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. They don't want him talking about why people can't afford housing, specifically in Texas. Now let's talk specifically about James Talarico because he's different from a lot of Democrats. He's thoughtful, he's articulate, he's comfortable discussing his Christian faith. He often explains his political beliefs through a moral and religious lens. That's unusual in today's Democratic Party, and I actually think it's one of his strengths. But strengths can become vulnerabilities depending on how your opponent frames them. Republicans aren't going to show a 30-minute interview where James Talarico carefully explains the position. They're going to take 15 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe 30 if they feel generous. They'll pull out the clip they think creates the strongest emotional reaction from y'all, and they'll run it over and over and over again. James Talarico believes in transgender. James Talarico says God believes in transgender. James Talarico believes in gays. James Talarico believes in X, Y, and Z. That's exactly what they're going to run. That's the modern politics for Republicans. Nobody gets judged by everything they say. They get judged by these 15, 20-minute clips. We've already seen it happen. Them coming out and trying to laugh and call him a vegetarian. James Talarico has talked openly about LGBTQ issues. He's talked about Christian nationalism. He's talked about faith, inclusion. Whether people agree with him or disagree with him isn't really the point I'm making. The point is the Republicans already know exactly which clips they're going to use. They aren't guessing. They're collecting footage right now. Every speech, every interview, every podcast, sermon, television appearance, because that's what modern campaigns in the Republican Party do. Now, here's where I think Democrats sometimes misunderstand the challenge. They think if they explain their positions better, they'll solve the problem. I don't think that's how political advertising works anymore. By the time you're explaining yourself, your opponent has already called you gay. That's why campaigns talk so much about defining yourself before somebody else does. First impressions matter. Now, I also think Republicans understand something about Texas that Democrats sometimes underestimate. Texas is still a culturally conservative state in many ways. That doesn't mean every Texan is conservative. Doesn't mean every community votes Republican. But it does mean there are millions of voters whose decisions are influenced by faith, family tradition, churches, and cultural values. Republicans aren't trying to win every argument. They're trying to convince those voters that James Talarico doesn't share their worldview. They're trying to convince voters that James Talarico likes transgender. They vote that James Talarico believes in abortion. If they succeed, they don't have to beat his economic message. They simply have to make sure voters never get to hear it. That's incredibly effective politics. Now, here's the challenge for James Talarico. I don't think he should pretend to be somebody he's not. I don't think candidates should suddenly change all their beliefs because they're running statewide. Voters usually see through that anyway. Authenticity matters, but authenticity also means accepting that some positions come with political costs. Every candidate makes those calculations. Every campaign decides where it's willing to take political risks. James Talarico will have to decide the same thing. Can he communicate his values in a way that reaches voters who don't automatically agree with him? Fear travels faster than facts, and 30-second commercials usually beat 35 minutes worth of explanation. That's just the reality of modern campaigning. Okay. Republicans have been using the cultural war politics successfully for years because it's worked. Campaigns repeat strategy. Every person in this country is scared of immigrants. Every person in this country is talking about gays and trans. There's only gays and trans only make up like 1% of the whole population. And every time you hear a Republican speak, the first thing out of their mouth is something about gay or trans. Donald Trump was good at making sure that y'all understood gay and trans. He made sure that y'all understood immigration. The immigrants are coming to take my jobs. Immigrants are doing this, that, and the other. They made sure that because that's what Republicans run on. They run on cultural issues. They never run on policies because they don't have policies. Republicans don't have policies. The only policies they have is tax cuts. And nobody that is getting beat up by the economy today gives a damn about tax cuts, gives a damn about cutting taxes so you can get a tax cut. They care about bread and butter issues. But this is what the Republicans are going to run on. They're going to run on the cultural issues. They're going to run on, well, he's gay. He likes trans. God likes binary. He thinks God believes in abortion. They're going to run on those kind of things. Just you watch. Listen to what Ken Paxton says. Listen to how Ken Paxton is trying to define James Talarico and his faith. Because this is what the Republicans do when they don't have policies. And most times they don't have policies. Because somebody from Texas, I would love to hear how the Texas being run by the Texas legislature, Texas Congress, whoever. I would love to find out how your life has been better under a Texas rule. How they made your life better. What did they bring to your life? Did they bring healthcare to you? Did they bring housing to you? Did they bring free college to you? Did they bring free school lunches to you? What did they bring to your life that would say to you, I think I need to vote Republican over a Democrat? This is where that battlefield is going to be for James Talarico. Okay? This is where it's going to be. He comes across as authentic. He comes across as articulate. He rarely loses his train of thought. He quotes history. He quotes scripture. He can explain complicated ideas in an easy way that people understand. People may think he's rehearsed. I don't think he's rehearsed. I think he's just a very intelligent human being. Okay. When he speaks, he's prepared. He's thoughtful. He's measured. He's disciplined. Again, he sort of reminds you of how Obama used to speak. Okay. Almost polished, not rehearsed, but just a little bit more polished, a little bit more smarter. That's a picture. They're going to try to create him as a caricature. They're going to try to portray him as being rehearsed and not really authentic. Okay. This is how they're going to come across or try to present him as that. Okay. and he is far from being polished. He's just a very articulate human being. That's all, right? So the whole point is he has many, many challenges in the Democratic problem. But the hardest part is this coalition building. In fact, if you listen to everything I said up to this point, you probably realize that every chapter has really been leading here. The white working class, rural voters, Latino voters, black voters, young voters, the culture war, authenticity, the brand. None of those groups exist in isolation. They're all fit together. That's what campaigns mean when they talk about building a coalition. And building a coalition is a whole lot harder than giving a good speech. Think about everything James Talarico has to balance. If he spends too much time talking about progressive policies, Republicans will say he's too liberal for Texas. If he spends too much time trying to reassure moderates, some progressives will wonder why he's backing away from the issues that they care about. If he talks too much about faith, some people who are not religion may become uncomfortable. If he avoids talking about faith, Republicans will say he doesn't understand Texas values. Every decision creates another decision. That's coalition politics. He's constantly trying to bring different groups together without making one group feel like they've been forgotten. Now let's go back to Jasmine Crockett, and then I'll end here for a minute because I think this is where the entire conversation fits into the larger picture. Some people looked at the controversy and saw a disagreement between two Democrats. I think I looked at it and saw a reminder that coalitions require maintenance. They require communication. They require respect. They require people to feel like they're partners instead of political tools that only become important during election cycles. That's true for blacks, Latinos, labor unions, teachers, young voters, suburban professionals. Everybody wants to know that they're part of something bigger than simply helping somebody else get elected. That's why I think campaigns sometimes focus too much on endorsements and not enough on relationships. An endorsement can get you one news cycle. A relationship can get you volunteers, neighborhood organizers, pastors, business leaders, all those kind of things. Those things can't be bought with campaign money. They have to be earned over time. Now, here's another challenge. Coalitions don't just have different priorities. Sometimes they have competing priorities. That's what makes leadership difficult. One group may want you to talk about immigration every day. Another group wants you talking about education, blah, blah, blah. Another wants economy. Every one of those issues matters to somebody, but you only have so much time in a campaign. That's why candidates have to establish a theme that's bigger than any one audience. People need to know what your campaign is about. Know not just what you're for, but what you're about. Those aren't always the same thing. If somebody asked the average Texan today, what does James Talarico stand for? Would they have the same answer? Some would say education. Others would say democracy. Others would say Christianity. That's not necessarily a problem this early in the campaign, but eventually voters need a simple answer they can explain. Republicans understand that. Whether you agree with them or not, they generally reduce complicated campaigns to very simple things. They know repetition matters. They know clarity matters. If you keep saying gay, 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 trans, 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 you eventually you're going to hear people talk about that. And I hear about people say that all the time in my chat. Oh, would the Democrats want to talk about gay and trans and all this other stuff. Our country is in more trouble than a little. And the gay and trans issue is not as important as us getting the food prices and gas prices and housing prices and all those things down. Okay? James Talarico has an opportunity in Texas. Regardless of party, they want competent government. They may disagree on how to get there, but there are very few people wake up hoping government becomes less effective. They want roads, schools, hospitals, food, housing. They want all these things to work. Government ain't supposed to be a television show. It's supposed to solve problems. And if James Talarico can make competence the thread that ties all these different communities together, he has a chance to build a growing coalition, a broader coalition than people expect. Because competency isn't a Democratic value or a Republican value. It's an American expectation. So hopefully his coalition can survive these attacks. Okay? Let's hope they can survive all these attacks. I'm a Democrat. And I would love for James Talarico to win. I would love for him to win. Okay? So we can go back to where we start. Everybody wants to talk about Ken Paxton. Everybody wants to make this election about Ken Paxton. Everybody wants to ask about whether James Talarico can beat Ken Paxton. I think that's the wrong conversation. Not because Ken Paxton doesn't matter. He absolutely does matter. He's the Republican nominee. He's going to have enormous financial support. He's going to have one of the strongest Republican political machines in the country. He's going to have Donald Trump endorsements. He's going to have Republican voters who are already prepared to support him no matter what, even though he's a trash human being. He's a trash husband, trash worker, scandal-ridden, corrupt. He's all of those things. Pretending Ken Paxton isn't a formidable opponent would be foolish, though. But I still think he's James Talarico's biggest problem. He isn't James Talarico's biggest problem. Not even close. The biggest problem is Texas. The biggest problem is that Texas has become one of the most difficult states in America for Democrats to win. That's simply the political reality. You don't change that because one candidate gives a great speech. You don't change that because somebody goes viral. You don't change that because national Democrats get excited. You change it over one voter, one neighborhood, one county, one relationship, one election over time. That's how political realignments actually happen. Throughout this video, I've talked about white working class, rural Texas Latinos, blacks, youngers, suburbans, independent, his faith, authenticity. I've talked about coalition politics. None of those chapters exist by themselves. Every one of them affects the other. That's what makes statewide campaigns so difficult. You're never solving one problem. You're trying to solve 10 problems at the exact same time. And every decision you make helps one group while creating new questions for another one. That's leadership. Now, here's what I don't want people to take away from this video. I'm not saying James Talarico can't win. I'm also not saying he will. That's not what this analysis has been about. I'm saying the conversation needs to become much more honest. Too much political commentary today sounds like sports talk. People pick teams, people cheer, predict winners and losers. Then they spend the rest of the campaign trying to prove they're right. It doesn't really teach us anything. I'd rather understand why campaigns succeed. I'd rather understand why campaigns fail. Because once you understand the obstacles, you also understand what success actually looks like. If James Talarico eventually wins statewide, it won't be because he gave one incredible speech. It won't be because of a commercial. It won't be because Ken Paxton is bad. It'll be because he successfully built a coalition that was larger than the coalition the Republicans built. That's it. That's all. Politics is complicated. Election math ain't. At the end of the night, somebody adds up the votes. One coalition is bigger than the other one. The campaign with the bigger coalition wins. Everything we've discussed today has really been about one question. Can James Talarico build a coalition? Can he improve working class Texans? Can he make Republicans work harder? Can he stop Republican gains along Latino voters? Can he maintain the enthusiasm and trust of black voters? Can he get the young vote? Can he get the faithful vote? Can he get the culture war attacks? Can he survive the culture war attack? Can he persuade independents every day about the real issues? That's the campaign. That's the race. Ken Paxton is only part of that story. Now, I also want to say something to Democrats. I think Democrats sometimes make the mistake of believing demographic change automatically creates political change. It doesn't. Every voter has to be persuaded. Every generation has to be persuaded. Every election starts over. Nobody owes either political party their vote. Not black voters, not Latino voters, not young voters, not suburban voters, not rural voters. Nobody. Every campaign has to earn support. That's the way democracy is supposed to work, and I think that's actually healthy. The moment either party starts believing it owns a community's vote is the moment it stops listening to the community. Listening is how coalitions are built. Assumptions are how coalitions shrink. Finally, let me come back to Jasmine Crockett because that's really where this entire conversation began for me. People look at the controversy and saw a disagreement. I look at it and saw something else. I saw a reminder that coalitions require constant work. Respect requires constant work. Trust requires constant work. Black voters feel like they have been disrespected. Every time they come up and they bring a worthy candidate up to be voted on or to be supported, they can't get the support for the black candidate. It's always a Hispanic or a Latino or white candidate. It's never the black candidate. Okay? Kamala Crockett. I forgot her name. I forgot the other lady's name. I'm sorry. That's true in Texas. That's true everywhere. So as this campaign moves forward, don't just watch the polls. Don't just watch the fundraising. Don't just watch television commercials. Watch who shows up, who feels energized, what coalition feels overlooked. Watch which communities are being visited. Watch which conversations are happening, because those things usually tell you far more about the outcome of the election than any poll released 18 months before election day. That's why I said at the beginning that I thought people were asking the wrong question. Question ain't whether James can beat Ken. The real question is whether James Talarico can build a coalition that's bigger than Texas's Republicans coalition that they built for the past 30 years. If the answer is yes, then Ken Paxton becomes just another Republican standing in the way. If the answer is no, then it honestly won't matter who Republican nominee is, because the biggest obstacle won't have to be Ken Paxton. Biggest obstacle will have been Texas itself. So we're going to see. We're going to see what James Talarico does. We're going to see whether he's going to try to build a coalition. He's going to have to straighten those margins out. Let's see what he does. I don't know. It looks like an uphill battle to me, but I could be wrong. But the first groups you got to get over there to your side is the working white and the rural white. You got to bring the margins down. You got to bring the margins from 75%, 25% for the Democrat, 75% for the Republican. You got to bring this shit down to 60 or 55, 45 to 40. You got to bring it down. Otherwise, it ain't going to never work. You ain't never going to win Texas. You can make a shot at it, and he's probably one of the best candidates to make a shot at it, but let's see what happens. You never know what's going to happen. I don't know. Maybe he will win. Maybe he won't. I don't know. But, hey, these people want to vote for Talarico. They want to vote for him, and they want to vote for him. I just don't see how you would, even as a Republican, I would stay home before I vote for Ken Paxton. But that's just me. So if you like my content if you like my content and anything of my review of Texas and Talarico, please hit the like, share, and subscribe. I usually have content Monday through Thursday at 10 p.m. and I will see you guys, I don't know, maybe tomorrow morning, maybe Saturday morning. I will see you guys then. I appreciate the like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate it. And I like to bring content, and this was one of the biggest ones that I had to talk about. It's longer than what I normally talk to people about, but I appreciate you guys sticking around, and I appreciate you. Please hit the like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate you guys.